southwest of Abilene. The endless empty landscape of West Texas stretches for nearly 100 miles before the town of San Angelo rises like an oasis.
It's fairly isolated. It's not on the road to many places. If you go west of San Angelo, you're just going to get into mesquite desert and oil field.
It's kind of a slow-paced town. It's small enough where people know each other.
Although the population out here is growing, the people of San Angelo strive to maintain their strong support of the many family-owned businesses and laid-back atmosphere that help keep its old-world Texas charm.
It's a very pretty town. Trees, rivers, parks. It's just not a flamboyant town. You have that rugged individualism.
People in San Angelo have a lot of West Texas pride. It may take people a little while to warm up to you when you move there, but after a while, the people settle in pretty well.
In November 2004, settling in is just what 24-year-old newlywed and new father Mike Severance is trying to do. Originally from Maine, the staff sergeant has spent the last 4 years based up the road at Dyess Air Force Base in Abilene.
I think the culture, I think it just fit his personality. He learned how to line dance and two-step and just fell in love with the area and the people.
Mike's bride, 25-year-old Wendy Mae Davidson, is a local girl.
What attracted Mike was that she was smart, she was fun. They enjoyed going out dancing and having a good time.
Wendy is also starting a promising career as a veterinarian, opening a clinic in her hometown.
Wendy was an impressive young woman. She graduated from Texas A&M, a very prestigious school. Her family was from San Angelo. She had deep roots in San Angelo.
The young family lives in a small apartment adjacent to Wendy's practice downtown. Although the 100-mile commute back and forth to base in Abilene is hard on Mike, the airman is determined to make it work. And as the couple begins building their life together, they seem poised for success.
Mike and Wendy were the American dream. They had their whole future ahead.
With the marriage, a new baby, and business, 2004 has been a whirlwind year for the newlyweds. So at Christmas, Mike puts in for leave.
So what's Maine like?
Well, it's a lot colder than it is here, that's for sure. But
And the family plans a vacation to Maine in mid-January to see Mike's folks and introduce them to their new grandson.
gonna see snow for the first time.
Mike and Wendy had bought airplane tickets and the trip was set. Wendy had never been out of the state of Texas. They were really pumped up about going.
Yeah, you guys are gonna love it.
Mike was very excited to show them where he grew up. My family had set up a little wedding reception for him. We wanted to welcome Wendy into our family.
But in the early hours of Sunday, January 16th, the day that Mike and Wendy are supposed to fly to Maine, something goes horribly wrong.
Oh, I can't find Mike anywhere.
Wendy had called, said they weren't going to make the flight,
I have no idea where he would have gone.
that Mike was missing.
I thought maybe he would be with you guys in Maine.
Mike's family is confused by the early morning phone call.
You just need to calm down, Wendy.
Wendy walks through the last 36 hours, claiming that on Friday night, she and Mike had gone out.
A date night, and then
She said that they went out to the bar across the street, had a few drinks and danced a little bit and had a good time.
They got home late, and Wendy let Mike sleep in Saturday morning. He finally got up around noon, and she saw him in their veterinary clinic around 3 p.m.
the early afternoon, and that was the last time that I saw him.
She didn't know where he was, but I wasn't that worried about him being missing. I figured he'd call in a few hours, but we were disappointed he wasn't coming home.
We're gonna find
Mike's family figures that the young couple probably just had an argument.
I'm freaking out. I have no idea where he went.
I had told her, I said, he'll turn up. He probably drove to Abilene and was just cooling down a bit.
But when they learn that his truck is still outside, alarm bells go off.
Michael's pickup was at the clinic, so he obviously didn't leave in it. And if he left, how did he leave?
The Severances tell Wendy to file a missing persons report with the local police department. And while Wendy contacts the authorities,
Nice Air Force Base.
Mike's family calls his commanding officer.
In touch with my son, Staff Sergeant Michael Severance. We haven't seen him in a little while, and we're just trying to check in on him, make for sure everything's okay.
No, sir. It doesn't look like he's checked in.
But Mike isn't there either.
Yes, have a good day, sir.
And as far as the Air Force is concerned, he's on leave, so there isn't anything more they can do.
We figured, yeah, maybe he was at somebody else's house that we didn't know, because he had a lot of friends that we didn't know about, away from the base.
48 hours later, there's still no word from Mike.
We started getting concerned then and worried then that something happened because everything pointed in the very wrong direction of Mike's character.
They knew this wasn't Mike. They knew Mike didn't disappear.
Local authorities open an investigation. Part of the team searching for Mike is 12-year veteran of the Texas Rangers, Major Sean Palmer.
Officers and investigators with the police department began doing interviews and taking statements from Wendy.
At the police station, she tells detectives that Mike hadn't been himself lately.
He just started getting mad at me, just going out a lot, drinking a lot. He started going to the liquor stores and buying beer, which he never did that before. He did.
She made it clear to investigators that Michael was in a downward spiral. He was acting bizarrely.
According to Wendy, the Thursday before Mike disappeared, he had taken their son without her permission and vanished for an entire day.
And I kept calling his cell phone, he wouldn't answer. A few hours later, he calls me, and I said, "Where are you?" He goes, "I'm in Abilene." I said, "Why did you go to Abilene? Why didn't you tell me you were going? Please don't leave here without these telling me."
That incident left her shaken. Investigators wonder what Wendy thinks could be triggering Mike's odd behavior.
He also made little comments about how he hated his job, it was so boring, it was the same thing over and over.
Wendy told the police that Michael hated the Air Force and he did not want to be deployed. He did not want to go back to the war zone.
He was afraid that something bad was going to happen. And he kept saying it would be so easy just to go into Canada.
Wendy was talking desertion.
With her permission, investigators searched the couple's home, looking for any sign that the airman was getting ready to flee.
Nothing missing? Everything's here?
All of his things are here.
And Mike had left behind luggage and clothes that he had prepared for the trip. Basically, the only thing that he took were his pair of jeans, a shirt, boots, and a belt.
This is wallet and cell phone?
He didn't go anywhere without his wallet, his phone, or his cowboy hat, and they were all still there.
This is that?
What's more, investigators don't see any sign of a struggle or foul play. But they begin to wonder if something else equally disturbing has happened.
Sometimes when people leave things behind, especially a cell phone or a wallet, or things of importance like that, you become concerned that perhaps they left and committed suicide.
Detectives wonder about Mike's mental state, but his family and friends say that Mike would never consider hurting himself.
He's too full of life for that. He was too excited from having the baby and getting to spend time with him, and he wouldn't have done anything like that.
The way we were brought up, the way we were raised, suicide isn't an option. There was no way, in my mind, that Michael committed suicide.
Although if Mike did kill himself, investigators assume he would have done it in a place where he could be easily found. So over the next week, the mystery only deepens as the detective search comes up completely empty.
Motels were checked in the area, the local rental car agencies were checked, airlines were checked, with negative results.
Mike hasn't used a credit card or taken any money out of the bank.
It became very concerning that there was no trace of Mike. There was no evidence to lead investigators to figure out what had happened to him.
Investigators are stumped, and his family is beginning to fear the worst.
But probably somewhere deep down we figured either something's really, really bad or he's not with us anymore.
In the winter of 2005, detectives from the San Angelo, Texas Police Department are coming up empty-handed in their search for missing Staff Sergeant Mike Severance, a new local resident. and his friends and family are losing hope.
We were all worried, wanting to know where he was at, what happened to him, because it wasn't like him to just up and leave without saying something.
The last thing for investigators to check is Mike's cell phone history. But as they wait for the phone company to release the records, a strange thing happens. Life in San Angelo goes on as usual.
Because of the fact that he wasn't from there, a lot of people there in town probably didn't even realize that Mike was missing and that there was an investigation ongoing.
I think it would have been very different if he would have been a local, born and raised. Nobody knew his family. He had no roots. Nobody knew him in San Angelo.
8 days after he disappears, Mike's leave from the Air Force expires. When he fails to report for duty, Mike's officially declared absent without leave. Now deemed a criminal desertion, the case triggers a full-scale military investigation.
The Air Force is going to do what they need to do to try to find you. They're going to use every means possible.
The Air Force Office of Special Investigations, OSI, immediately forms a task force with the San Angelo Police Department, the Sheriff's Office, and the Texas Rangers. Leading the Air Force's effort to find the missing airman is Special Agent Arch Harner.
We immediately started considering all the possibilities. Could have been murdered, or he could have walked off the property and got injured, or, as Wendy had suggested, deserted the Air Force to avoid a deployment.
With more resources at their disposal than local law enforcement, the OSI is able to widen the search. They do a full-scale sweep of the area around Mike and new wife Wendy Mae Davidson's home and veterinary clinic.
They did an aerial search, they did a ground search, and they came up with nothing.
With no trace of Mike anywhere near his home, investigators begin looking for accomplices.
We had considered, as in most deserter cases or AWOL cases, that there would be some kind of connection between the deserter and his or her family members. Our theory was Wendy was in contact with him or knew of his whereabouts.
The Air Force brings in computer technicians to begin hunting for an electronic trail, checking Mike's email and search engines, and Wendy fully cooperates with their plan.
Can we take the hard drive?
Take whatever you need to find him.
At that time, we received consent from Wendy to mirror her hard drive so we could do a computer forensic search of that hard drive.
The analysis will take time to complete. So while they keep an eye on Wendy, investigators move on, turning to the other people close to Mike.
Do you think Mike is capable of desertion?
But when they ask his friends from the base if Mike might have deserted his post, they all have the same response.
There's absolutely no way Mike would do that.
That wasn't Mike. The guys that knew Mike knew he wasn't just going to take off and leave just to keep from deploying.
Mike's a solid guy.
That wasn't going to happen.
Experience tells investigators not to assume anything.
I never heard anything about that.
Just because they haven't said anything to any of their colleagues
I would have heard something.
doesn't mean they don't intend to desert.
Are you sure about that?
People don't advertise that they're going to go AWOL, so we have to have an open mind about these kinds of matters.
What's interesting to investigators is what Mike has shared with his colleagues.
What do you know about his marriage? I think they met at a bar back in Abilene.
Mike's friends tell them his marriage to Wendy didn't have what you would call a fairy tale beginning.
They found out that it was more of a, I wouldn't say a one-night stand, but more of a casual encounter.
You know, she got pregnant. You know, there wasn't a lot of time for them to get to know each other. You know, it was pretty quick.
It's not the most solid way to start a life together, but it's also not uncommon in military towns. A lot of guys on base start their families that way.
He told me that he was going to marry her, and I said, "Are you sure you want to do that, Mike?" And he told me that, you know, I want to try to do the right thing.
And I tried to talk him out of it and at least wait, get to know her a little bit, you know, make sure that's what you want to do.
The airman thought it was his duty, so Mike made a promise to Wendy and their future together.
That was his life, and he was going to live his life. You couldn't talk him out of doing things, hardly.
Hello, Mr.
The
Severance.
following day, investigators talked to Mike's family in Maine to ask them about the marriage.
The marriage is okay. They have had some issues.
What kind of issues?
The Severances claim that although things had moved quickly between Mike and Wendy, if Mike had any complaints about his life in San Angelo, it was not with his wife,
He has had a hard time dealing with the family.
but his in-laws.
Mike is from Maine, and I think they would prefer a local boy.
Wendy's parents, it's no secret, they didn't care for Michael. You could tell there was a certain vibe that maybe Mike wasn't good enough for their daughter.
For your time.
They were very protective of their family.
If you're not from San Angelo, you're never from San Angelo. Mike was from Maine, and that was a big deal in this situation. He would have never been accepted as somebody that grew up there.
When investigators reach out to Mike's mother and father-in-law, they don't even try to hide their disdain for him.
It became apparent that there was some conflict there within the family. Mike's mother-in-law, in particular, was not a big fan of his.
Wendy's mother says that she resents Mike. He's lazy and does nothing to help Wendy around the clinic or at home.
Search the premises, take a look around.
They willingly consent to a search of their house and property.
The investigators, they want to make sure that he wouldn't be hidden out by Wendy's family or his friends or anyone. They couldn't leave any stone unturned, any lead had to be followed.
Once again, the search comes up empty. And 3 weeks into the investigation, the people closest to Mike realize that investigators are running out of places to look for him, compounding their frustration and worries that something awful has happened.
They were exhausting all possibilities. So it kind of hit that something's not right.
And I was like, something happened. It's not good. So I knew something was wrong.
It's nearly a month after Mike goes missing that investigators finally get a piece of evidence to work with. When Texas Ranger Major Sean Palmer receives Mike's subpoenaed cell phone records, he notices something suspicious.
3 days after Wendy filed her missing person report, somebody had tried to call Mike's phone late at night. One call was approximately 12:30 a.m. and the next call was maybe an hour later.
The phone calls are very short in duration. It's as if someone called and hung up. Major Palmer suspects that this might be some kind of signal.
It could be somebody that knew where he was or had helped him leave.
When investigators trace the calls, they connect to a woman from Hamlin, Texas, a small town roughly 2 hours from San Angelo.
We were determined to find out who this woman was and why she'd be calling Mike's cell phone late at night.
Could Mike be having an affair? Or perhaps this mystery woman's connection to the airmen is even more devious than that. On February 8, 2005, nearly a month after Staff Sergeant Mike Severance goes missing, Texas Ranger Major Sean Palmer tracks down a woman who made suspicious calls to Mike's cell phone just 3 days after the airman disappeared.
Hello, this is Allison.
Once I learned that it was a female that was calling Mike's phone, it became important to find out what her relationship was with Mike.
I was cleaning out.
Over the phone, Allison McClay explains to Major Palmer that she had only dialed Mike's number in an attempt to solve her own mystery.
Yeah, it took me a while to figure out who it was.
She had seen a contact in her phone with the name of Mike, and she had called it trying to determine who that was. Okay.
Major Palmer finds the explanation a bit odd. But Allison insists that she only knows Mike through her ex-boyfriend, Jeff Holden. Allison says the two men know each other through their shared hobby of racing cars. Investigators have never heard of Jeff.
One of the possibilities that we were thinking about was the fact that this friend of Mike's may be hiding him.
Major Palmer and another officer head out to talk to Jeff in Hamlin, Texas, a small town 90 miles from San Angelo. He agrees to come into the local police station for an interview. Once there, Jeff tells investigators that he and Mike have known each other for 5 years.
How'd you know that he was missing? A friend called me and told me. I was shocked.
but he claims that he doesn't know anything about his disappearance.
You know, they was just asking questions of what kind of person was Mike, what'd we do. They was serious.
When was the last time that you saw him?
Oh, it's been months. Ever since he got married, I haven't seen him much.
They would ask the same question like 5 or 6 different times. I guess they was wanting to see if my stories changed, or I just answered the questions and told them what I knew.
Now we take a look around your house.
After an hours-long interview, investigators ask if they can search Jeff's house, and he agrees.
They pulled up with the headlights shining just right there at the front door. I opened the door and I said, "Come on in."
Investigators search every room, finding no sign of Mike. Then, Jeff admits he has something else to tell them. It's about his friend's marriage.
Mike wasn't very happy.
What do you mean?
Although it looked like Mike and Wendy had a start of a great new life, this friend of Mike's did not think that it was a match made in heaven.
They were fighting a lot through their marriage.
Like how bad?
Mike had told him that things were rough and that he was unhappy and was considering getting out.
I would say they were definitely heading toward a split.
Bad enough for him to just run away.
Jeff insists never in a million years would Mike walk away from his child.
He wouldn't do that.
No, I knew something was fishy. I mean, he's not the kind just to run off. That's not Mike. I doubt very seriously Mike would ever abandon his son.
If Mike was actively trying to get out of the marriage, it's possible there was a custody dispute on the horizon.
I can't take this anymore. I'm sick and tired of doing everything by myself.
In their initial interview, Wendy told detectives she'd been distraught when Mike had disappeared for an entire day with the baby.
They got into an argument, and Mike took his son and drove to Abilene. Wendy kind of read him the riot act because he had taken the son without her permission.
Mike?
In light of this new information, investigators wonder if Mike's actions affected more than just Wendy.
Mike, where did you go? You took the baby.
Wendy was upset. Her mother was irate. And it was just an innocent trip. That was a big, big deal for the family.
No idea where they would have went.
Perhaps Wendy and her parents thought Mike's trip to Abilene was a dry run for something more deceitful. The baby's next trip was to meet his family in Maine, scheduled for the day Mike went missing.
I think that's what her parents were feeding her. He's gonna go back to Maine and you're never gonna see him again. I think Wendy believed Mike would take her son.
But with no sign of foul play, investigators know it's only a hunch. They have no choice but to continue to treat the case as a criminal desertion. Still, they take another hard look at Wendy.
They decided that they needed to track Wendy and see what that might lead them to.
Operating under federal guidelines for military cases, Air Force investigators begin monitoring both Wendy and her parents' movements, placing GPS trackers on their cars. When the information is analyzed, Wendy's parents' trackers show nothing unusual. But Special Agent Harner's team does find something that piques their interest on Wendy's.
We discovered that Wendy's car had traveled to a remote area on a nearby ranch.
In fact, Wendy has made the trip several times since Mike was reported missing.
The ranch property was away from the normal pattern that Wendy would take as far as visiting her family or the normal places she might go.
Investigators approach the rancher, a close friend of Wendy's family, and get consent to search his property. From the GPS, they're able to pinpoint the exact location where Wendy had gone.
We happened to stop at the area where we had seen that the car had stopped. A somewhat large stock pond with a dock. There was nothing odd about the stock pond.
And there's nothing else on the ranch that seems unusual either. But investigators are convinced that there's something more to Wendy's suspicious trips. Agents call her and casually ask about the property.
She indicated that she kept horses out there. The ranch was something they had access to and they enjoyed.
She said she hadn't been to the ranch in quite a while. We knew this wasn't true.
And it isn't long before investigators discover something else suspicious.
One of the steps that was taken early on was that the Air Force investigators imaged the computer that was in the clinic. They got results back about the same time that they had learned about Wendy going out to the ranch.
That computer forensic search uncovered that someone had searched for the phrase body decomposition in water.
This became very important because at the location of the ranch that Wendy had traveled to was a large pond. The information brought into light that there may be something more to this than just a missing person.
Major Palmer takes over the new lead. He decides to confront Wendy about the computer searches.
I went to the clinic unannounced and attempted to interview her.
You have a minute?
Sure. Caught her cold just to see how she would react.
Discovered an internet search on how a body decomposes in water.
Wendy brushes off his questions.
Explain that.
She was very nonchalant in her answers and laughed, in fact.
I was imagining the worst case scenario.
Wendy indicated that she had queried the decomposition of a body in water because searches had been conducted around the area of the clinic, and there was a small creek out there. And so her explanation was that what happens if they find Mike in the creek?
Well, actually, we're thinking about searching another body of water.
When Major Palmer mentions to Wendy that they're going to conduct another search of the ranch, she has a strange reaction.
She became very quiet, and her demeanor changed quite a bit.
I have an appointment I'm going to right now, so we can talk about this later.
With that, Major Palmer knows they're on to something.
Be in touch.
He leaves Wendy at the clinic and calls Special Agent Harner, asking him to secure the property until they can gain access again.
We headed out towards the ranch. Our purpose was to make sure if there was evidence of the scene, then no one could tamper with that evidence before it could be properly collected.
When he reaches the property, Special Agent Harner is stunned by who he finds there.
She was standing outside the car, trying to operate the lock on the gate. Wendy said to me, "What are you all doing out here?" I replied, "Wendy, what are you doing here?"
I have to feed my horses.
She said, "I'm gonna go into the gate now." And I said, "Wendy, you're not going anywhere."
Wendy gets back in her car, and a short time later, she leaves. Special Agent Harner lets her go. He stays at the ranch gate, determined to guard it. A few hours later, San Angelo Police Department receives a strange phone call from Wendy's brother.
"I need someone to meet me at Great Creek Cemetery. It's an emergency."
Intrigued by his odd request, detectives make their way to the old burial ground on the outskirts of town and find Wendy and her whole family are already there.
What's going on here?
As investigators try to make sense of the scene, Wendy's brother drops a bombshell.
"Have y'all searched the pond out at the ranch?"
No.
"You need to. Mike's body's in there."
Wendy had told her family that Mike Severance's body was in the pond.
I was trying to protect you!
And at some point, one of the investigators heard Wendy say, "I didn't kill him. Somebody else did, but I moved him."
On March 5th, 2005, 6 weeks after Airman Mike Severance mysteriously disappeared, investigators are stunned when they hear Wendy Davidson admit to moving her husband's body.
I found Mike dead at the clinic, but I didn't do it. I didn't kill him.
Wendy doesn't talk to investigators, but her brother tells them that on the day before they were supposed to leave for Maine, Wendy said she found him dead in the clinic.
She says she thought she was protecting her family
and decided to hide his body.
She had thought one of them may have hurt him, and she had transported the body to that stock pond and dumped him there.
The following day, divers search for Mike.
A few hours after initiating the search of the pond, one of the dive team members was able to locate a body.
that have been tied to a wheel and cinder blocks. A variety of things to weigh it down.
Those items were connected to the body with rope and monofilament line. Somebody spent a lot of time trying to make sure that nobody would find the body in the pond.
After removing the weights underwater, the divers bring the victim to shore. And investigators can see the aftermath of what must have been a brutal ordeal.
The medical examiner determined that there was 41 stab wounds to the body.
The coroner orders toxicology tests, and because of the condition of the body, it'll take some time before he can determine the cause of death. Although they'd suspected foul play, the reality of the discovery shatters Mike's family and friends.
I didn't want to see it coming, but I think somewhere deep down, after a little while, you start trying to prepare yourself for the grief, for the loss.
It affected the Air Force, especially here at Dias. I mean, we were all heartbroken and in disbelief that something, like that happened to somebody so close to us.
In the town of San Angelo, people are stunned.
Once that body was found and it went public, it was all people were talking about. And the community was just abuzz about this. I was like everybody else in San Angelo, horrified that this airman was murdered.
How could somebody do that? You hear stories like this happening, but you never think it will happen local. And then, until it does. I just didn't ever see anybody doing that to Michael.
On March 7th, 2005, police arrest Wendy and charge her with evidence tampering for moving Mike's body. And once in custody, investigators again attempt to question her.
Well, this earlier you didn't want to say anything. Is that...
I don't want to say anything.
We'll have some answers here pretty soon.
Speak to a lawyer first. Sure. That's what she told you to do.
With Wendy pleading the fifth, investigators are left puzzled. Although she led them to her husband's remains, who killed him is still a mystery.
People couldn't put their heads around it. The rumor mills start and people have different theories and that she couldn't have done it, not our sweet Wendy.
The following day, investigators go back to Mike and Wendy's apartment and her animal clinic to conduct another search.
And one of the items that was located during that search were a couple of spools of monofilament line, similar to what we had seen attached to the body.
Detectives then search Wendy's parents' home. They find nothing there to connect them to any crime. But the investigation takes another dramatic turn when a week after Mike's body is discovered, with Wendy sitting in jail, her parents file for custody of Wendy and Mike's baby boy. 2 days later, Mike's parents do the same, launching an ugly legal fight.
Michael's family wanted to protect Michael's child. Wendy said she thought somebody in her family did it, and it was all, at that point, very unclear as to what happened.
During the proceedings, Wendy's parents' mistrust of the Severance family becomes clear. They're reluctant to even let Mike's brother and his father, Leslie, spend time alone with the boy.
We don't trust them. We think they'll run back to Maine. They finally agreed on a meeting in a public place, and Les and Frank were able to visit with the child.
Wendy's parents are eventually awarded custodial rights to Mike and Wendy's son. Then, 4 months after Mike's body is pulled out of the pond, investigators find the final piece of the puzzle. And what happened to the former airman is more shocking than anyone imagined.
I didn't know what to think. How can someone do that? He was put down inhumanely like an animal.
Turns out the killer got careless, and the cops just found the trail of clues. On July 2nd, 2005, 4 months after Mike Severance's body is found, the San Angelo, Texas coroner's office releases the final autopsy report.
The medical examiner determined that the stab wounds were post-mortem.
Someone had stabbed Mike 41 times after he was dead, probably in an attempt to make sure his body stayed at the bottom of the pond.
But one of the things that happens is that gases build up inside the body, and that's what causes the body to rise to the surface. So it appeared that the stab wounds may have been done to prevent that from happening.
It's the same information that his wife, Wendy Davidson, had been researching on her computer. From the toxicology tests, the medical examiner has also determined a cause of death.
They had identified high levels of phenobarbital and pentobarbital inside Mike's body.
The drugs that they discovered in Michael were the exact same drugs that a veterinarian would use to euthanize an animal.
And we knew there was one place where those drugs would be kept and where we had seen them.
Investigators head back to Wendy's clinic, convinced they've got the key to the crime and the means for catching Mike's killer.
So those drugs were seized, and also records of how those drugs were dispensed to animals.
When investigators compare the records against Wendy's patient files, they quickly discover that one is missing.
One of the files that we were searching for was for an animal, a dog, that had been administered phenobarbital. And then we found the folder in the trash.
The dog's name is Wheezy, and in his discarded file folder, a log entry written in blue ink indicates that no medication was administered to him. But someone had crossed that information out.
And then it was written in black that the dog had been administered phenobarbital and Valium. The treatment record for the dog had been altered.
Wendy's altered records show that Wheezy had been given a very large dose of phenobarbital.
Let's contact them.
Investigators are certain that Wendy gave Mike the drug instead. They have their killer. Putting all the pieces of evidence together, they develop a timeline of the murder.
It seemed that the night that Wendy and Mike went out, he was most likely poisoned.
With their baby away at the sitters, investigators believe Wendy dropped tablets of pentobarbital into something Mike drank, knocking him out. Then, she took a syringe and gave her husband a fatal dose of phenobarbital. Wendy then dragged Mike's body to his pickup and drove to the ranch to dump him in the pond.
And at some point thereafter, learned about what would happen to that body and went out there and added additional items to weight him down and stabbed the body to release the pressure of the gas.
On September 22, 2005, Wendy Mae Davidson is charged with first-degree murder for killing her husband, Staff Sergeant Michael Severance.
Wendy told everyone that Mike deserted, and that was her error.
Same thing over and over. He didn't want to be deployed.
That backfired. It drew suspicion to her. It drew suspicion to the situation.
As Wendy's case moves toward trial, she continues to stick to her claim that she didn't kill her husband. But in October 2006, after realizing that the evidence was enough to convict her, Wendy waives her right to a trial.
And they allowed her to plead no contest, which is not admitting guilt. But the judge was very clear, said if you plead no contest, I'm still going to find you guilty of this crime.
Wendy Mae Davidson is sentenced to 25 years in a Texas state prison. She's up for parole in 2019. Her parents and her brother are never charged with any crime. In Maine, Mike's family still tries to make sense of the tragedy.
We lost a son, a brother, and in our eyes, a hero. I always joked he was my Superman. He was the one that I leaned on when I needed somebody to talk to. Now I don't have that.
She took a loving man, a loving father, and a good friend to a lot of guys. She took that away from us.
On school breaks, Mike's son is allowed to visit his family in Maine.
Gets to go up there and spend time. And that side of the family is letting his son know what kind of dad he doesn't have.
I wish Mike was here to see his child grow. He's a spitting image. I see a lot of his dad in him. I love my nephew. I just hope someday when he's older, we can be as close as me and his dad was.
In San Angelo, with one of their own now behind bars for a calculated and shocking murder, the community is still stunned. A tiny piece of that local Texas pride has been tarnished forever.
She was the local girl. It was a real difficult issue to deal with and to try to understand and grapple with. So it was just a huge event in the life of a community.
It's crazy, it's scary when somebody does something like that. One minute you have your good friend and then this blink of the eye is gone.
There are crimes that shatter a family. There are crimes that haunt a neighborhood. And then there are crimes so cruel, so inexplicable, that they seem to vanish into the darkness with the person who committed them, leaving behind only unanswered questions, aging evidence boxes, and memories that refuse to fade. For decades, the murders of 2 teenage girls in Utah belong to that last category. Different years, different streets, different lives. Yet hidden inside a few microscopic cells was a connection nobody could prove at the time. The answer had always been there, trapped inside technology that did not yet exist, waiting patiently for science to catch up with evil. Long before anyone spoke of forensic genealogy, long before DNA databases became household terms, 2 families were forced to live with the unbearable silence of not knowing. Every birthday became another reminder of what had been stolen. Every Christmas left one chair permanently empty. Every passing anniversary raised the same impossible question. Who did this? The first nightmare began in the summer of 1985. Salt Lake City was settling into another warm July evening. Children still rode bicycles until sunset. Neighbors recognized each other by name. Parents expected their kids home before dark, but rarely imagined that ordinary routines could become permanent goodbyes. 14-year-old Stephanie Isaacson had plans that were as simple as any teenager's. She laughed easily. She spent time with friends. She looked forward to growing up in a world that still seemed full of possibilities. Nothing about that day suggested it would become one of the darkest chapters in Utah's criminal history. When Stephanie disappeared, panic spread quickly. At first, there was hope. Perhaps she had gone somewhere unexpected. Perhaps she had missed a ride. Perhaps she would walk through the front door with an innocent explanation that would erase everyone's fears. But as the hours passed, optimism gave way to dread. Search efforts expanded. Family members, friends, volunteers, and officers looked anywhere a frightened teenager might have gone. Every empty lot became significant. Every abandoned building demanded another search. Every phone call made hearts race. Then came the discovery no family should ever have to endure. Stephanie's body was found in a secluded area, discarded with shocking brutality. The scene answered one terrible question, but created dozens more. Investigators immediately recognized they were dealing with far more than a missing person case. The teenager had been sexually assaulted before being murdered. Whoever attacked her had displayed a level of violence that suggested complete indifference to human life. Crime scene technicians worked methodically. Every fiber mattered. Every footprint mattered. Every strand of hair, every fingerprint, every biological trace was carefully collected, photographed, cataloged, and preserved. Experienced detectives understood something important. Cases like this often depended on tiny details overlooked in the chaos of a violent crime. Evidence that appeared meaningless today could become decisive tomorrow. What they did not know was that tomorrow would take nearly 4 decades to arrive. The investigation exploded across the city. Hundreds of interviews were conducted. Neighbors described unfamiliar vehicles. Residents reported strangers walking through the area. Friends tried desperately to remember whether Stephanie had mentioned anyone following her or making her uncomfortable. Every possibility was examined. Investigators built timelines. They compared witness statements. They checked known sex offenders. They reviewed parole records. They chased anonymous tips arriving at all hours of the day and night. Some tips sounded convincing. Others collapsed within minutes. One suspect appeared promising until his alibi checked out. Another attracted attention because of a prior criminal history, but forensic comparisons eliminated him completely. Weeks became months. Months became years. Boxes filled with interview transcripts began collecting dust on evidence shelves. Yet one crucial piece of evidence remained frozen in time. Biological material recovered during the investigation could not tell detectives what they desperately needed to know. In 1985, DNA profiling was still in its infancy. The science capable of identifying an unknown killer from microscopic genetic material simply was not available to local investigators. The evidence waited. Patiently. Silently. Almost as though it understood history would eventually return. For Stephanie's family, however, time never truly moved forward. Life continued because it had to. School graduations came and went. Friends became adults. Children who once played outside eventually raised families of their own. But inside one household, July never truly ended. Every anniversary reopened wounds that had never healed. Parents attended community events hoping someone might finally speak. They answered the same questions from reporters year after year. They pleaded for information. Someone had seen something. Someone always knows more than they admit. Yet the silence remained unbroken. Detectives retired. New detectives inherited the files. Fresh eyes studied old photographs. Investigative theories changed with each generation. Some believed Stephanie had encountered a stranger. Others suspected someone familiar with the neighborhood. A few wondered whether the murder had been connected to another unsolved assault somewhere else in the state. Without definitive evidence, every theory remained exactly that. A theory. Nothing more. Years passed before another tragedy unfolded less than 20 miles away. By then, investigators had begun accepting a painful possibility. Stephanie's killer might never be found. Cold cases have a peculiar way of changing the people assigned to them. Unlike fresh investigations driven by urgency, cold cases demand patience. They require detectives willing to read thousands of pages that someone else already read. They ask investigators to notice contradictions buried inside decades-old witness interviews. Most importantly, they require belief. Belief that even after years of disappointment, one overlooked detail might still unlock everything. Stephanie's file remained active. Not because detectives had fresh leads every week, but because someone refused to let her become forgotten. Evidence storage became almost sacred. Technicians ensured biological samples remained properly preserved. Every transfer was documented. Every seal remained intact. No one could predict when forensic science would evolve again. No one wanted to lose the opportunity if that day ever came. Meanwhile, Utah continued changing. Neighborhoods expanded. Roads widened. Entire generations grew up unaware that one of the state's most haunting unsolved murders still lingered beneath everyday life. News coverage gradually faded. The headlines disappeared. Television crews stopped calling. Only anniversaries briefly brought Stephanie's name back into public conversation before another year slipped away. To the public, the case had become history. To her family, it remained painfully present. Then, 3 years after Stephanie's murder, another family found themselves living the exact same nightmare. The similarities would not become immediately obvious. At first, the two investigations traveled separate paths. Different victims, different detectives, different evidence, different circumstances. No one yet realized that somewhere beyond the crime scene stood a single predator whose violence had crossed years without leaving a name. In September 1988, 17-year-old Nanette Vanderburg disappeared after leaving work. She was responsible, hardworking. Like countless teenagers, she balanced school, responsibilities, friendships, and dreams that stretched far beyond another ordinary Friday. She never made it home. Hours passed. Then came the growing panic every family recognizes instinctively. Phone calls produced no answers. Friends had not seen her. Coworkers believed she had left normally. The clock continued moving. Fear replaced optimism. Search efforts intensified. Officers retraced possible routes. Volunteers searched fields, roadsides, and isolated areas. Every passing hour reduced the chances of finding her alive. Eventually, investigators discovered what nobody wanted to hear. Nanette had been murdered. Like Stephanie before her, she had suffered a brutal attack that shocked experienced investigators. The similarities were impossible to ignore. Young female victim, sexual assault, extreme violence, body abandoned. No obvious motive beyond predatory brutality. Detectives immediately questioned whether Utah faced a serial offender operating in silence. Could one killer be responsible? Or had two unrelated monsters committed nearly identical crimes within the same region? Without modern forensic tools, certainty remained frustratingly out of reach. Evidence from both investigations existed. But evidence alone could not identify an unknown face. Laboratories compared fingerprints. No match. They examined shoe impressions. Nothing conclusive. Witness descriptions varied too widely to establish a reliable suspect. Sketch artists produced images based upon uncertain memories. Thousands of copies circulated. None generated the breakthrough investigators desperately needed. Years became decades. Technology improved slowly. DNA profiling eventually emerged as one of the most revolutionary developments in criminal investigation. Cases once considered impossible suddenly became solvable. Across the United States, forgotten evidence boxes were reopened. Unknown offenders finally received names. Families who had waited 30 or 40 years began receiving unexpected phone calls from detectives. Hope returned to places where hope had nearly disappeared. Inside evidence vaults in Utah, preserved biological samples from Stephanie Isaacson's murder and Nanette Vanderburg's murder quietly waited for their turn. Scientists now possessed tools investigators in the 1980s could scarcely have imagined. But even powerful DNA testing presented one enormous obstacle. Having a genetic profile was not the same as having a suspect. The profile belonged to someone who had lived an ordinary life after committing extraordinary violence. Someone who had walked through grocery stores, attended family gatherings, celebrated holidays, perhaps even watched news reports about the very crimes he committed. He had remained invisible because his name existed nowhere investigators could find. Until one extraordinary scientific breakthrough promised to change everything. A breakthrough capable of reaching not only the guilty, but generations of relatives connected by blood. The investigation was about to enter an entirely new era, one that would challenge decades of assumptions and reopen wounds many believed would never heal. The evidence had survived. The questions had survived, and somewhere hidden inside a single genetic code, the truth had survived as well. For years, the evidence sat untouched by progress. Not because investigators had stopped caring, but because science had not yet caught up with the questions they needed answered. The files remained open, reviewed periodically by new detectives who inherited more than paperwork. They inherited the responsibility of explaining why 2 young lives had ended so violently and why no one had ever been held accountable. By the early 1990s, DNA profiling had begun changing criminal investigations across the United States. What had once been considered an experimental laboratory technique was becoming a practical investigative tool. Police agencies started revisiting old evidence, especially in cases involving preserved biological material. The hope was simple. Perhaps technology could reveal what witness statements, interviews, and thousands of investigative hours never could. In the Stephanie Isaacson investigation, evidence collected in 1985 was re-examined under newer forensic standards. Laboratory scientists were able to develop a DNA profile believed to belong to the perpetrator. It was a remarkable scientific achievement compared to what had been possible only a few years earlier. Yet the breakthrough came with a frustrating limitation. A DNA profile without a matching suspect was like possessing a fingerprint with no identity attached to it. Investigators entered the profile into national databases as they expanded over time. They waited. Every new offender added to the system represented another possibility. Every database update carried a faint hope that a notification would appear on a detective's computer screen. Nothing happened. Years passed without a match. The same process unfolded in the investigation into the murder of Nanette Vanderburg. Evidence collected in 1988 was also subjected to improved DNA testing. Scientists successfully generated another genetic profile. When forensic specialists compared the 2 cases, the results were striking. The biological evidence indicated that the same unknown male was linked to both murders. For investigators, this was a pivotal discovery. It did not identify the killer, but it transformed 2 separate cold cases into a single investigation. Detectives no longer searched for 2 unknown offenders. They were looking for one individual whose crimes had occurred years apart and who had somehow escaped detection for decades. The realization raised difficult questions. If the same offender had committed both murders, had he attacked anyone else? Were there additional victims who had never been connected? Had he left Utah? Or had he spent decades living an ordinary life within the very communities affected by his crimes? Investigators reviewed unsolved sexual assaults, disappearances, and homicides across Utah and neighboring states. They searched for similar victim profiles, comparable crime scene characteristics, and patterns that might suggest a broader series of offenses. Some cases appeared promising at first. Most ultimately lacked sufficient forensic evidence to establish a connection. The investigation expanded, but certainty remained elusive. Throughout the late 1990s and into the early 2000s, advances in DNA technology continued at an extraordinary pace. Laboratories became more sensitive. Smaller samples could be analyzed. Degraded evidence that had once been considered unusable sometimes yielded valuable genetic information. Still, one obstacle refused to disappear. The unknown DNA profile did not correspond to anyone already in the criminal databases. This suggested several possibilities. The offender may never have been convicted of a qualifying crime requiring DNA collection. He may have died before such laws existed. Or he may simply have avoided further contact with the criminal justice system. For detectives, each possibility was equally frustrating. Cold case investigators often describe their work as assembling a puzzle while knowing that several critical pieces are missing. Every confirmed fact narrows the possibilities, yet the complete picture remains just out of reach. The files on Stephanie Isaacson and Nanette Vanderburg grew thicker with each passing year. New laboratory reports, updated forensic analyses, fresh interviews with surviving witnesses, occasional tips from members of the public. Many tips reflected sincere attempts to help. Others emerged after television programs featured unsolved murders. People reported suspicious former neighbors, estranged relatives, former classmates, or acquaintances whose behavior had always seemed unusual. Every credible lead required evaluation. Most ended exactly where earlier investigations had ended, with insufficient evidence. Meanwhile, the families continued living with uncertainty. Justice delayed is often described as justice denied, but for relatives of homicide victims, delay also carries another burden. Time changes memories. Witnesses move away. Some pass away. Physical evidence can deteriorate despite careful preservation. Entire investigative teams retire. Each passing year increases the difficulty of solving a case that was already extraordinarily complex. Yet detectives refuse to abandon the investigation. Several agencies maintained close cooperation, recognizing that the linked DNA profile represented one of the strongest pieces of evidence available in any unsolved homicide. The science was reliable. The identity remained unknown. Then another revolution quietly began, not inside police departments, but within the field of human genetics. Researchers and private genealogy companies were building enormous databases intended not for criminal investigations, but for family history. Millions of people voluntarily submitted DNA samples hoping to discover distant relatives, trace ancestral origins, or construct family trees extending back generations. To genealogists, these databases represented historical curiosity. To experienced investigators, they hinted at something entirely different. What if an unknown suspect had never submitted DNA himself? Could investigators instead identify one of his relatives? Could distant cousins, unknowingly participating in genealogy research, provide the first path toward identifying a killer? Initially, the concept seemed almost impossible. Traditional criminal investigations searched for exact matches. Genetic genealogy searched for family relationships. Instead of asking, "Whose DNA is this?" the question became, "Who could this person be related to?" The distinction changed everything. As the technique gained national attention through several high-profile investigations, cold case units across the country began evaluating whether their own unsolved murders might benefit from the same approach. The process was painstaking. Genealogists constructed enormous family trees spanning multiple generations. Birth certificates, marriage records, census documents, military records, obituaries, newspaper archives, property records. Every available historical document contributed another branch to increasingly complex family networks. The work required patience measured not in days, but in months, sometimes years. Investigators studying the Utah murders recognized the potential. The preserved DNA profile remained exceptionally valuable. Unlike many older cases where biological evidence had degraded beyond use, these investigations still possessed genetic material capable of advanced analysis. The challenge shifted from science to history. Someone somewhere shared part of the unknown killer's genetic inheritance. Finding that connection would require combining forensic biology with traditional genealogical research on a scale few criminal investigations had ever attempted. As the technology matured, agencies carefully evaluated legal procedures, privacy considerations, and evidentiary standards. Every investigative step needed to withstand eventual courtroom scrutiny if a suspect were identified. The goal was never simply to generate a name. The goal was to establish evidence strong enough to prove that identification beyond reasonable doubt. Detectives understood another important principle. Genealogy could point investigators toward a family. It could suggest possible individuals. It could narrow an enormous population to a manageable number of candidates. But it could not, by itself, prove guilt. Traditional police work still mattered. Background investigations, employment histories, residence records, vehicle ownership, travel patterns, interviews, surveillance when appropriate, and ultimately, comparison of crime scene DNA with a legally obtained reference sample from the suspected individual. Only then could decades of uncertainty finally begin giving way to answers. For the families of Stephanie Isaacson and Nanette Vanderberg, none of these complex scientific developments erase the pain of the past. But somewhere beyond laboratory reports and archival documents, investigators believed they were closer than ever before to identifying the man whose DNA had silently connected two murders committed 3 years apart. The evidence had survived nearly 40 years. Now, for the first time, science offered a realistic path toward discovering the identity hidden within it. For nearly 4 decades, the killer behind 2 devastating murders remained a name without a face. To investigators, he existed only as a genetic signature, a sequence of numbers and scientific markers stored inside laboratory files. A profile that could tell them one undeniable truth. The same man had been responsible for the deaths of Stephanie Isaacson and Nanette Vanderberg. But DNA alone could not reveal where he lived. It could not show detectives his childhood photographs. It could not explain how he moved through society unnoticed. It could not answer the question that had haunted 2 families for decades. Who was he? By the late 2010s, the landscape of criminal investigation was changing rapidly. Cases once considered permanently unsolvable were beginning to move again. Old evidence was being examined through a completely different lens. Investigators were no longer limited to searching traditional law enforcement databases. The rise of forensic genetic genealogy opened a new door. Instead of looking only for a direct DNA match, specialists could analyze genetic relationships. A distant cousin, a second cousin, or even a more remote relative could become the first thread leading back to an unknown suspect. For cold cases, this represented a fundamental shift. A person did not need to have committed a previous crime. They did not need to appear in a police database. They did not need to leave behind a recent record. They only needed a relative somewhere in a genetic database. The science did not instantly solve cases. It created a pathway. Behind every successful identification was a mountain of work. Genealogists examined genetic connections and built family trees that stretched across generations. They traced marriages, migrations, births, and deaths. They studied relationships between people who often had no idea they were connected. A small genetic match could lead to hundreds of names. Hundreds of names had to become dozens. Dozens had to become a handful. And eventually, investigators needed to determine which individual fit the evidence. The Stephanie Isaacson and Nanette Vanderberg investigation entered this new era with one of the most valuable pieces of information possible, a confirmed DNA profile belonging to the same unknown male. That profile represented the bridge between the past and the present. The crimes had happened in the 1980s, when investigators had limited tools. The suspect had disappeared into everyday life. But his biology had remained behind. The first step was to upload the unknown DNA profile into a genealogy database used for investigative purposes. The objective was not to immediately identify a suspect, but to find genetic relatives connected to the unknown man. The results created a new investigative map. Researchers began examining potential family connections. Every relationship became a possibility. Every surname became a clue. Every branch of a family tree carried the possibility of leading investigators closer to the truth. But the process was slow. Unlike television portrayals, forensic genealogy does not produce instant answers. There is no single computer screen that suddenly reveals a criminal's identity. The reality is hours of detailed research, careful verification, and the elimination of countless possibilities. A person could share DNA with the unknown offender for many reasons. They might be related through a distant ancestor. They might belong to a large extended family. They might live in another state. They might have no idea that their genetic information was connected to a decades-old homicide investigation. The investigators needed patience. They needed accuracy. And they needed to avoid the danger of rushing toward the wrong person. History has shown that wrongful suspicion can destroy lives. A genetic connection is a clue, not a conviction. Every potential candidate must be evaluated through traditional investigative methods. The genealogy research gradually narrowed the field. The family lines became clearer. The possible locations became more focused. Investigators began constructing a picture of a man who had existed long before they knew his name. A man born into a specific family. A man connected to certain communities. A man whose timeline could be compared against the dates and locations of the murders. Every detail mattered. Where had he lived in 1985? Where had he lived in 1988? Was he old enough? Was he physically capable? Did his background contain information consistent with the crimes? Slowly, a possible identity began to emerge. But even with a promising candidate, investigators needed more than probability. They needed proof. The suspect could not simply be confronted because a genealogy search suggested a connection. Authorities needed a DNA sample directly linked to the individual. This created another challenge. Investigators had to obtain that sample legally and carefully. Surveillance became part of the process. Detectives monitored the candidate's movements. They waited for an opportunity to collect discarded biological material. Items such as objects touched or used by the individual could potentially contain DNA suitable for comparison. Every action required precision. The entire case rested on one scientific question. Would the suspect's DNA match the profile preserved from the crime scenes decades earlier? For the first time in the investigation's history, detectives were no longer searching through thousands of unknown possibilities. They were approaching one specific person. But the passage of time created another layer of complexity. Decades had passed since the murders. People had changed. Communities had changed. Memories had changed. The suspect, if still alive, would now be much older than the person who committed the crimes. The investigators were not looking for the same face witnesses might have remembered in the 1980s. They were looking for the person behind the DNA, a biological signature that had remained unchanged. The investigation also forced detectives to revisit the original cases with new eyes. Old evidence was reviewed. Old reports were examined again. Details once considered minor gained new importance. The timeline of each victim's final moments became essential. The locations, the opportunities, the circumstances, everything had to align. The murders of Stephanie Isaacson and Nanette Vanderberg were separated by 3 years, but the DNA evidence showed they were connected by one person. That connection transformed the cases from isolated tragedies into a single story of unanswered violence. For the families, however, scientific progress came with complicated emotions. After decades of waiting, hope returned. But hope carried uncertainty. Every promising development created the possibility of another disappointment. Cold case families often learn to protect themselves from expectations. They have experienced too many false leads. Too many moments when investigators believed they were close, only to discover another dead end. Yet this time was different. The technology was different. The evidence was different. And investigators were closer than they had ever been. The same DNA that had once represented a dead end had become a roadmap. A roadmap leading backward through decades of hidden history. The unknown offender had spent years believing the past was buried. He had lived through technological revolutions that transformed the world around him. He had watched society change. He had watched crime investigations evolve. But one thing had remained constant: the evidence. The biological trace left behind at the scenes of two terrible crimes had waited patiently through every passing year. Now, investigators were finally following that trail toward the person responsible. The question was no longer whether science could identify him. The question was whether the man connected to that DNA would finally be brought into the light. For decades, the murders of Stephanie Isaacson and Nanette Vanderberg existed as two painful reminders of unfinished justice. The victims had names. Their families had memories. Investigators had evidence. But the person responsible remained hidden behind a wall of uncertainty. Then science began breaking through that wall. The investigation had reached a point that detectives from the 1980s could never have imagined. The same evidence that once represented frustration and unanswered questions had become the strongest path toward the truth. A small biological sample, invisible to the human eye, carried a story that had survived nearly 40 years. It carried a genetic identity, and now investigators were determined to discover who that identity belonged to. The forensic genealogy process continued quietly. Behind the scenes, specialists analyzed genetic connections, building family trees that stretched across generations. The work required a combination of science and historical investigation. DNA provided the relationships. Records provided the history. Together, they created a map. Every branch of the family tree represented another possibility. Every name required examination. Researchers studied birth records, marriage documents, geographic locations, and family connections. The process was not about finding a single answer immediately. It was about removing every impossible answer until only the most likely remained. A distant genetic connection could lead investigators thousands of miles away from the actual suspect. A family name could appear important, but ultimately lead nowhere. A promising lead could collapse after one simple fact was discovered. Investigators had to remain patient, because after nearly 40 years, one mistake could destroy the opportunity they had waited decades to reach. Eventually, the research began pointing toward a specific family line. A possible connection emerged. The unknown DNA profile appeared to belong to someone connected to that lineage. The search moved from an entire population to a much smaller group of potential individuals. Now investigators began comparing facts. Age, location, life history, criminal background, personal circumstances. The questions became more specific. Who in this family could have committed these crimes? Who lived in Utah during the relevant years? Who would have had the opportunity to encounter the victims? Who matched the timeline? Every detail mattered because the evidence needed to tell a complete story. The investigation could not rely only on genetics. A family connection was only the beginning. The next step was identifying a living person whose DNA could be compared directly with the evidence collected from the crime scenes. This stage required careful surveillance and planning. Investigators watched. They waited. They gathered information. They needed a legally obtained DNA sample from the individual they believed might be responsible. The process was invisible to the public. While communities continued their daily routines, a decades-old murder investigation was moving toward its most critical moment. The investigators knew the significance of what was happening. They were not simply solving an old case. They were attempting to provide answers to families who had spent almost an entire lifetime waiting. The first breakthrough came when investigators obtained a DNA sample from the person of interest. Now there was only one question that mattered. Would it match? Inside forensic laboratories, scientists compared the genetic markers from the newly collected sample with the DNA profile preserved from the crime scenes. The comparison represented the moment decades of investigation had been building toward. A match would confirm that the person under investigation was connected to the biological evidence recovered from the murders. A mismatch would return the case to uncertainty. For the families, for the detectives, and for everyone who had worked on the investigation, The answer carried enormous weight. The results confirmed what investigators had hoped to prove. The DNA matched. The unknown profile that had haunted the case for decades finally had a name. The discovery represented a dramatic turning point. But it also opened a new chapter of questions. How had the suspect avoided detection for so long? What had happened during the years between the murders and his identification? Had anyone around him known anything? Had there been warning signs that were overlooked? Cold cases often reveal a disturbing reality. The people responsible for terrible crimes do not always appear like the monster society imagines. They can exist quietly. They can work. They can maintain relationships. They can move through communities unnoticed. The passage of time does not erase what happened. It only creates distance. For investigators, identifying the suspect was a major achievement, but the responsibility continued. A DNA match was powerful evidence, but prosecutors needed to build a complete legal case. They needed to explain the investigation clearly. They needed to present evidence that connected the suspect not only scientifically, but historically. The courtroom would eventually become another arena where decades of unanswered questions would be examined. The families who had waited so long were now facing a complicated moment. Justice was finally moving forward. But no arrest, no conviction, and no courtroom result could bring Stephanie and Nanette back. Nothing could restore the future stolen from them. Nothing could erase the pain carried by their loved ones. The purpose of solving these cases was not to rewrite the past. It was to acknowledge it. To say that these victims were not forgotten. Their names had survived. Their stories had survived. And the evidence they left behind had finally spoken. The investigation also demonstrated how dramatically criminal justice had changed. In 1985 and 1988, detectives worked with the tools available to them. They followed leads. They interviewed witnesses. They preserved evidence. They did everything possible, but technology placed limits on what they could discover. Decades later, a new generation of investigators inherited those same cases. They combined traditional detective work with modern genetic science. The result was something once considered impossible. A killer who had remained unidentified for nearly 40 years was finally exposed through evidence collected before many of today's forensic technologies even existed. The breakthrough was not caused by one single discovery. It was the result of persistence, of evidence preservation, of investigators who refused to close the files permanently, of scientists who continued improving forensic techniques, of families who continued demanding answers. The story of Stephanie Isaacson and Nanette Vanderberg became a powerful example of how time can change the possibilities of justice. A case that once seemed frozen forever had moved again. A mystery that survived decades had finally begun revealing its secrets. But behind the scientific achievement and investigative success remained the human reality. 2 teenagers had lost their lives. 2 families had lived through unimaginable grief. And 2 communities had carried the memory of those crimes for generations. The DNA had provided an answer. But it also reopened the painful reality of what happened. Because every solved cold case begins with the same heartbreaking truth. Someone was taken. Someone was loved. And someone waited years for the world to finally remember their name. For Stephanie Isaacson and Nanette Vanderberg, that wait had lasted far too long. But after decades of silence, the evidence had finally broken through. The voice of the past had finally been heard. The identification of the man connected to the DNA evidence marked the end of one chapter. But for investigators, it was only the beginning of another. Solving a cold case is not simply about finding a name. It is about proving a story that must survive scrutiny. A story that must explain what happened, how it happened, and why the evidence leads to one person and no one else. For nearly 40 years, the murders of Stephanie Isaacson and Nanette Vanderberg existed as unanswered questions. Now, investigators finally had the opportunity to connect the evidence preserved from the 1980s to a living suspect. The scientific breakthrough was powerful, but detectives understood that the courtroom required more than a DNA match. They needed context. They needed timelines. They needed to reconstruct the past. The investigation returned to the original crime scenes, not physically, but through the thousands of pages of documents created decades earlier. Every report was reviewed again. Every interview was reconsidered. Every piece of evidence was examined through the perspective of what investigators now knew. Details that once seemed isolated began forming a clearer picture. The two murders were separated by 3 years, but the connection between them had always existed. The same unknown DNA profile had linked the cases long before investigators knew the identity behind it. The evidence had been waiting. The suspect had been living with a secret. The victims had been waiting for justice. Now investigators had to bridge the gap between the past and the present. One of the greatest challenges in cold case investigations is the passage of time. A person who committed a crime decades earlier may no longer resemble the individual described by witnesses. Appearance changes. Circumstances change. Communities change. But DNA does not change. That became the central power of this investigation. The biological evidence collected from the crime scenes represented a direct connection to the person responsible. Not a rumor. Not a memory. Not a theory. A scientific link. As authorities continued building the case, they examined the suspect's background and personal history. Investigators looked at where he had lived, where he had worked, where he had been during the years surrounding the murders. They searched for information that could explain how the crimes occurred and why the suspect had remained unidentified for so long. Cold case investigations often reveal a difficult reality. A person can disappear from investigators' attention while continuing to live an ordinary life. The absence of another major criminal record does not mean someone is incapable of committing a terrible act. Some offenders are identified quickly. Others remain hidden for decades. The difference is often not the severity of the crime. It is whether evidence exists. In these cases, the evidence had survived. The breakthrough also demonstrated the importance of preserving forensic material. If investigators in the 1980s had not carefully collected and stored biological evidence, the future identification would have been impossible. The detectives who worked the original cases could not know what technology would become. They could not predict forensic genealogy. They could not imagine databases containing millions of genetic profiles. They simply followed the principles of investigation. Collect. Document. Preserve. Because someday, someone might discover what they could not. That future had finally arrived. For the families of Stephanie Isaacson and Nanette Vanderberg, however, the announcement brought emotions that were impossible to describe with a single word. There was relief. There was sadness. There was anger. There was a lifetime of memories suddenly connected to a legal process that had taken decades to begin. Many families of cold case victims describe this moment as complicated. They want answers. They want accountability. But they also must face the painful reality that solving a murder does not undo the damage caused by it. A courtroom cannot return a lost child. A conviction cannot restore decades that were stolen. Justice can acknowledge the truth, but it cannot reverse time. The victims remained at the center of the investigation. Stephanie Isaacson was not simply a case file. She was a teenager with dreams, friendships, and a future that should have continued. Nanette Vanderberg was not simply evidence in a homicide investigation. She was a daughter, a friend, and a young woman whose life was interrupted by violence. The passage of time had never reduced their importance. If anything, the decades of investigation demonstrated how deeply their stories mattered. The eventual identification also raised questions about the years between the murders and the arrest. For investigators, understanding those years was important. A person responsible for a crime of this nature leaves behind more than DNA. They leave behind a history, a series of choices, a pattern of behavior. Sometimes that history reveals answers. Sometimes it creates even more questions. The investigation examined whether the suspect had connections to other crimes, whether other victims might exist, whether other families had been waiting for answers without realizing they were connected to the same individual. These questions are common in cases involving repeat offenders. When one person is linked to multiple violent crimes, investigators naturally look beyond the known victims. The possibility that additional cases may be connected becomes another responsibility. Because every unidentified victim represents another family waiting in silence. Another name that deserves to be remembered. Another story that deserves an answer. The identification of the suspect also highlighted the growing role of forensic genealogy in modern criminal investigations. The technique has transformed many cold cases, but it has also changed the way investigators think. The search for a criminal is no longer limited to fingerprints, eyewitness accounts, and traditional databases. The search can now move through generations, through family connections, through genetic relationships invisible to ordinary investigation. A person can remain unknown to police while still being connected to a vast network of relatives. That reality has changed the future of cold case work. But the science is only as powerful as the people behind it. The detectives who revisit forgotten files. The laboratory specialists who analyze decades-old evidence. The genealogists who patiently reconstruct family histories. The victims' families who continue asking questions when the world moves on. Together, they form the chain that allows justice to reach across time. The story of Stephanie Isaacson and Nanette Vanderberg is ultimately a story about that chain. A chain that began with two investigations decades apart. A chain that survived changing technology, changing personnel, and changing generations. A chain held together by one piece of evidence that refused to disappear. For years, the killer's identity was hidden. But the truth was never gone. It was preserved. Waiting. And when the right moment arrived, the smallest trace left behind at a crime scene became powerful enough to speak across nearly 4 decades. The silence surrounding the cases had finally been broken. But for investigators and families, the journey was not only about discovering who was responsible. It was also about understanding the impact of what had been lost. Because behind every cold case is not just an investigation. There is a person. There is a family. There is a community that remembers. And there is a question that remains until justice arrives. Why did it happen? Why them? And how could someone live for so long knowing the truth was buried beneath the surface? After decades of uncertainty, those questions were finally moving closer to answers. For nearly 40 years, the murders of Stephanie Isaacson and Nanette Vanderberg remained frozen in time. The calendar continued moving forward, but the pain surrounding their deaths remained trapped in the years when their families last saw them alive. Now, with the identity behind the DNA evidence finally emerging, the investigation entered a new and deeply personal stage. The question was no longer simply who was responsible. The question became what happened after the crimes. How had the person connected to the evidence lived for decades while two families carried the weight of unanswered loss? Cold cases often create a strange contrast. The victims remain forever connected to the moment their lives ended. But the people responsible continue aging. They experience ordinary days. They watch seasons change. They celebrate milestones. They build memories. Meanwhile, somewhere else, families continue waiting for the truth. That contrast is one of the most painful realities of unsolved crimes. For investigators, identifying a suspect after decades requires reconstructing two different timelines. The timeline of the victims and the timeline of the person accused of taking their lives. The first timeline tells the story of what was lost. The second attempts to explain how the crime could happen and why the person responsible escaped justice for so long. In the Isaacson and Vanderburg investigations, the DNA connection provided the foundation. But detectives still needed to carefully examine the circumstances surrounding each crime. The murders had occurred during a different era. Technology was different. Investigative procedures were different. Communities were different. Yet the evidence demonstrated that some things remained constant. The offender. The biological signature. The connection between two tragedies separated by 3 years. The investigators who reopened the files faced a unique challenge. They were looking backward. Every detail had to be viewed through decades of change. Addresses had changed. Buildings had changed. People had moved. Some witnesses were no longer available. Some memories had faded. But official records remained. Police reports, laboratory documents, photographs, evidence logs. These became the foundation for rebuilding the story. A cold case is often described as a puzzle. But unlike an ordinary puzzle, many pieces are damaged by time. Some are missing. Some are difficult to interpret. And some only become meaningful after another piece is discovered. The DNA breakthrough became that missing piece. Suddenly, investigators could look at old evidence with a new understanding. The biological material collected decades earlier was no longer just an unknown sample. It was a direct connection to an individual. That changed the entire investigation. Every previous question could now be reconsidered. Every previous theory could be tested against a known suspect. Every unanswered moment in the timeline could be examined again. For the families, the development brought a painful mixture of emotions. Many relatives of cold case victims describe justice as something they want but never fully imagined receiving. After years of disappointment, hope becomes something carefully controlled. They learn not to believe every new lead. They learn not to expect every announcement to bring closure. Because closure is complicated. A solved case does not erase grief. It does not restore lost years. It does not remove the memories of the person who should still be there. But it does provide something that uncertainty cannot. The truth. For decades, Stephanie's family and Nanette's family carried a question that had no answer. Now, they finally had one. The investigation also represented a larger shift in criminal justice. Cases that once seemed impossible were being reopened across the country. Advances in DNA science transformed evidence collected decades earlier into powerful investigative tools. Cold cases were no longer simply forgotten files stored in archives. They became active investigations again. The Isaacson and Vanderburg cases became part of that transformation. They demonstrated that time does not always protect those responsible for violent crimes. A person can avoid identification for years. They can escape traditional investigation. They can believe that evidence has disappeared. But science continues moving forward. The evidence left behind can outlast the person who created it. The investigation also required careful consideration of another important issue. Solving a case is not only about identifying a suspect. It is about ensuring the legal process follows the facts. Investigators must avoid assumptions. They must separate evidence from emotion. They must build a case based on proof. The passage of decades makes this even more important. A person accused of a crime from the 1980s is not being judged by rumors or public opinion. They're being judged by evidence. And in these cases, the most important evidence came from the smallest possible source. DNA. A microscopic trace that had survived from the original crime scenes. A trace that carried the genetic information of the person responsible. A trace that waded through changing technology, changing investigators, and changing generations. The power of DNA is not only that it can identify someone, it can also connect events that investigators once believed were separate. Before the genetic link was discovered, Stephanie Isaacson's murder and Nanette Vanderburg's murder existed as individual tragedies. Two different files, two different investigations, two different families searching for answers. The DNA changed that. It revealed that the two cases belonged to the same story. The same offender. The same unanswered mystery. And ultimately, the same path toward justice. As investigators continued preparing the case, they also looked toward the victims themselves. Because the center of every homicide investigation is not the offender. It is the person who was taken. Stephanie was 14 years old. A teenager whose life had barely begun. She had experiences she would never have. Places she would never visit. People she would never meet. Nanette was 17. At an age when many young people are beginning to imagine adulthood, she was instead remembered through the tragedy that ended her life. Decades later, their names remained connected to something far more important than the crimes committed against them. They represented perseverance. They represented the families who refused to stop searching. They represented the investigators who kept the files alive. And they represented the idea that justice can sometimes travel a very long road. The conclusion of a cold case often feels like the end of a story. But for those who live through the pain, it is usually the beginning of another journey. A journey through court proceedings, through public attention, through memories reopened, through emotions that had been buried for years. The discovery of the truth brings relief, but it also brings the reality of what that truth means. Two young women were gone. Two families had suffered. And the person responsible had remained unidentified for decades. The DNA answer did not change history, but it finally gave history a name. The silence that surrounded these murders had lasted nearly 40 years. Now, that silence was beginning to break. And the world was finally forced to look back at two cases that had waited patiently for justice to arrive. Part 7. The discovery of a DNA connection between the murders of Stephanie Isaacson and Nanette Vanderburg represented a moment investigators had spent decades hoping would come. But even after science revealed the identity hidden behind the evidence, the weight of the investigation remained. Because cold cases are never only about solving a mystery. They are about confronting the human consequences left behind. For the families of Stephanie and Nanette, the passage of time had created a painful reality. The world continued moving forward, but the questions surrounding their deaths remained frozen. Every unanswered year carried the same uncertainty. Every anniversary carried the same memories. Every news report about another solved cold case brought the same difficult thought. Could their loved ones ever receive justice? Now, after decades of waiting, the answer was finally beginning to emerge. The investigation had traveled from handwritten reports and physical evidence collected in the 1980s to advanced genetic technology capable of revealing what detectives of that era could never have known. But the final chapter required more than science. It required examining the person behind the DNA. When investigators identify a suspect after many years, they must carefully reconstruct the individual's life history. They must understand where that person was, who they were connected to, and whether the available evidence supports the conclusion reached through forensic analysis. The goal is not simply to solve a mystery. The goal is to establish the truth. Investigators reviewed the suspect's background through the lens of the evidence. They examined records. They studied timelines. They compared known information from the original investigations with what had been discovered decades later. The passage of time created challenges, but it also provided something investigators in the 1980s did not have: a complete scientific link. The DNA profile recovered from the crime scenes had remained consistent for decades. It represented a direct connection between the offender and the victims. That connection became the foundation of the case. But the investigation also reminded authorities of a difficult reality. Technology can identify a person. It cannot explain why. DNA can reveal who left evidence behind. It cannot reveal what was happening inside someone's mind at the moment a crime was committed. That question often remains one of the hardest parts of violent crime investigations. What causes one person to commit an act that destroys multiple lives? Why does one individual choose violence while others facing similar circumstances do not? For the families, those questions are often impossible to answer. Many victims' relatives are not searching for explanations. They're searching for accountability. They want the world to recognize that a life was taken. They want the person responsible to face the consequences. They want their loved one's name to be remembered for more than the crime that ended their life. Stephanie Isaacson and Nanette Vanderberg were young women whose futures were taken away. Their stories did not begin with their deaths. They had families. They had friendships. They had hopes. They had ordinary moments that mattered. Cold case investigations sometimes risk reducing victims to evidence numbers and case files. But behind every report is a person whose absence changed an entire family forever. That reality remained at the center of this investigation. The breakthrough also highlighted another important element of cold case work: persistence. The investigators who eventually solved these murders were not the same people who first walked through the crime scenes. Many original detectives had retired. Some had passed away. Entire generations of law enforcement had changed. But the commitment remained. A case can survive beyond the careers of individual investigators. It survives because someone continues to believe that the answer exists. That belief is often what separates cases that remain unsolved forever from cases that eventually find resolution. In the years before the breakthrough, the investigation experienced the same frustrations faced by countless cold cases across the country. Leads appeared and disappeared. Suspects were considered and eliminated. Evidence was examined and re-examined. The public moved on. But investigators kept returning to the same central fact. Somewhere in the world was a person whose DNA matched the evidence. The challenge was finding him. For decades, that person remained outside the reach of traditional databases. The offender had avoided leaving a genetic record that investigators could access. But the evolution of forensic science changed the rules. The same DNA that once provided only confirmation that a crime had occurred became a pathway toward identification. It demonstrated one of the most remarkable principles in modern criminal investigation. Evidence does not always become weaker with time. Sometimes, evidence becomes stronger as technology evolves. A fingerprint from the past may remain just a fingerprint. A witness memory may fade. A document may be lost. But preserved biological evidence can continue waiting. It can remain silent for years. Then suddenly, it can answer questions that entire generations of investigators could not solve. The case also became a reminder of the importance of evidence preservation. When Stephanie's murder was investigated in 1985, and when Nanette's murder was investigated in 1988, the detectives involved were working with the technology available at that moment. They could not know how powerful DNA analysis would become decades later. They could not predict that evidence collected during their investigations would eventually identify the person responsible. They simply did their jobs. They documented. They collected. They preserved. Those decisions created the possibility of justice years later. For modern investigators, These cases serve as examples of why no cold case should be considered truly closed if evidence remains available. The definition of solvable continues changing. What appears impossible today may become routine tomorrow. The same scientific progress that solved these cases may one day provide answers in thousands of others. For families still waiting, that possibility matters. Because every cold case represents someone who has been missing from their family's future. Every unanswered murder represents a story interrupted. Every unidentified offender represents a question still hanging over a community. The resolution of Stephanie Isaacson and Nanette Vanderburg's cases sent a powerful message. Time may slow justice. It may delay answers. It may create years of uncertainty. But time does not erase evidence. And time does not erase the victims. Their names remained alive because people refused to forget. The investigators who reopened the files. The scientists who analyzed the evidence. The families who continued searching for answers. Together, they created a chain connecting the past to the present. A chain that began with two tragedies separated by 3 years. A chain that survived nearly 4 decades. A chain built from determination, science, and the belief that even the oldest mysteries can still be solved. But as the investigation moved closer to its conclusion, one final question remained. After all those years of uncertainty, after all the technology and detective work, after decades of waiting for answers, would justice finally bring peace to the families who had carried this burden for so long? Or would the truth reveal another painful reminder of what had been lost? The evidence had spoken. The identity had emerged. Now, the final chapter of the investigation was about to unfold. The moment investigators finally connected a name to the DNA profile was not simply the conclusion of a scientific search. It was the beginning of accountability. For nearly 40 years, the murders of Stephanie Isaacson and Nanette Vanderburg had existed in a painful space between memory and mystery. The evidence was there. The victims were known. The questions were endless. But the person responsible remained beyond reach. Now, the distance between the crimes of the past and the justice of the present was becoming smaller. The investigation that began with detectives walking through crime scenes in the 1980s had transformed into a modern forensic operation involving advanced DNA analysis, genealogy research, and decades of investigative persistence. But behind every scientific breakthrough was a simple truth. 2 young women had lost their lives. And 2 families had spent decades waiting for answers. Cold cases often create a unique emotional reality for those left behind. Unlike a sudden accident or illness, a violent crime leaves families with a question that never disappears. Someone chose to do this. Someone knows what happened. Someone walked away while their loved one never came home. That unanswered question can become part of everyday life. It appears during birthdays. It returns during holidays. It resurfaces whenever another case is solved and another family receives the phone call they have been waiting for. For the families connected to Stephanie and Nanette, the discovery of the person responsible represented something they had not experienced in decades. Certainty. The uncertainty was finally ending. But certainty does not always bring simple emotions. Justice can bring relief, but it can also reopen painful memories. It can force families to revisit moments they have spent years trying to survive. The announcement that a cold case has been solved often creates a complicated mixture of grief and hope. The victim is remembered. The investigation is recognized. But the loss remains permanent. No scientific discovery can restore the years that were taken away. No courtroom can return a future that was stolen. The purpose of justice is not to undo the past. It is to acknowledge it, to establish the truth, to hold responsibility where it belongs, and to ensure that victims are not forgotten. The investigation also revealed how much criminal justice had changed since the 1980s. When Stephanie Isaacson was murdered in 1985, DNA testing was not the powerful investigative tool it is today. When Nanette Vanderberg was murdered 3 years later, investigators were still relying primarily on traditional methods. Interviews, physical evidence, witness statements, detective work. Those methods remained essential, but they had limitations. A suspect could leave behind biological evidence without leaving behind a name. That was exactly what happened. The killer left something behind. But for decades, investigators had no way to translate that evidence into an identity. The advancement of DNA science changed that. The evidence collected decades earlier became more valuable with time. A sample that once represented only an unknown profile eventually became a connection to a specific individual. It was a reminder that evidence does not have an expiration date simply because a case becomes old. Sometimes, the answer is not missing. Sometimes, the world simply has not yet developed the tools to find it. The success of this investigation also demonstrated the importance of combining old-fashioned police work with new technology. Modern forensic methods did not replace detectives. They expanded what detectives could do. Genealogy research could narrow the search. DNA analysis could confirm biological connections. But investigators still had to ask questions, verify information, examine records, and build a complete case. Technology provided a direction. Human investigation provided the path. The work required patience because every step carried consequences. A mistake in a cold case can affect not only an investigation, but an entire family waiting for justice. That is why investigators must move carefully. A genetic connection may identify a family line. A family line may identify a potential suspect. But only verified evidence can establish responsibility. The process reflects a fundamental principle of criminal justice. The goal is not simply to find someone. The goal is to find the truth. As investigators continued examining the case, the broader impact became clear. The resolution of these murders represented more than one investigation. It represented hope for other families still waiting. Across the country, thousands of cold cases remain unresolved. Evidence sits in storage facilities. Families continue searching. Detectives continue reviewing old files. The question remains the same everywhere. Could today's technology solve yesterday's mystery? The answer from cases like Stephanie Isaacson and Nanette Vanderberg is yes. The past is not always unreachable. A crime committed decades ago can still leave a path forward. A forgotten piece of evidence can become the most important clue. A case considered impossible can suddenly move again. But the story of these murders is not only about technology. It is also about memory. Because cold cases survive through people. Someone remembers the victim. Someone preserves the evidence. Someone refuses to accept that an unanswered question should remain unanswered forever. That persistence is often invisible. There are no dramatic headlines for every detective who spends years reviewing old files. There are no public celebrations for every laboratory technician who carefully analyzes evidence. There are no cameras watching every family member who continues speaking a loved one's name. But those quiet efforts are what keep cases alive. The murders of Stephanie Isaacson and Nanette Vanderberg endured because people refused to allow them to disappear into history. Their names remained connected to a search for justice. Their stories continued being told. And eventually, the evidence that had remained silent for decades finally provided an answer. The investigation also served as a warning to those who believe time protects them. For decades, the person responsible lived with the knowledge of what happened. The world changed around him. Technology advanced. Investigators changed. But the evidence remained. The biological trace left behind at the crime scenes carried the information needed to identify him. The passage of time did not erase the connection. It only delayed the discovery. In the end, the breakthrough was not a single moment. It was the result of thousands of decisions made over many years. The decision to preserve evidence. The decision to reopen old cases. The decision to invest in new technology. The decision to keep searching. Every step mattered. Every person involved contributed to reaching the same destination. The truth. For decades, two families carried the weight of questions without answers. Then, after nearly 40 years, the silence began to break. A DNA sample collected from a crime scene became a bridge between past and present. A bridge connecting two victims, two investigations, and one hidden identity. The cases of Stephanie Isaacson and Nanette Vanderberg became another reminder that justice can travel a long road. Sometimes that road takes months, sometimes years, sometimes nearly a lifetime. But as long as evidence survives and people continue searching, the possibility of an answer remains. The final chapter of these cases was no longer about whether the truth would be found. The truth had been found. Now, the world had to confront what that truth meant. For decades, the murders of Stephanie Isaacson and Nanette Vanderberg existed as painful reminders of unfinished justice. Their names remained attached to two cases that had once seemed destined to remain unanswered forever. But the discovery of the DNA connection changed the meaning of those files. They were no longer only cold cases. They were evidence of a truth that had survived time. The investigation had shown that even when a case grows old, the responsibility to seek answers does not disappear. The families did not stop remembering. The investigators did not stop searching. And the evidence did not stop waiting. The DNA profile that connected the two murders became the central piece of a decades-long puzzle. It provided something investigators in the 1980s could never have achieved with the technology available at the time. A connection. A path. A way forward. But solving a case after decades is never as simple as discovering a name. A name begins another process. A process of understanding. A process of examining how the crime occurred, how the offender remained unidentified, and how justice could finally be delivered. Cold cases are unique because they contain two separate stories. The story of what happened, and the story of everything that happened afterward. For Stephanie and Nanette, the first story ended tragically. The second story became one of persistence. Their murders became examples of how investigations can evolve over generations. The detectives who first worked these cases could not rely on modern forensic genealogy. They could not search millions of genetic connections. They could not use technology that had not yet been invented. They worked with what they had. And because they preserved the evidence, future investigators had what they needed. That decision became one of the most important parts of the entire investigation. Evidence preservation is often invisible to the public. It does not create dramatic headlines. It does not produce immediate results. But in cold cases, it can become the difference between a mystery lasting forever and a case eventually being solved. A small piece of biological material can remain silent for years. Then one day, scientific advancement can give that evidence a voice. That is what happened here. The evidence collected decades earlier became the foundation for identifying the person responsible. It became a connection between two different moments in time. The first moment was the 1980s, a period when two families experienced unimaginable loss. The second moment was decades later, a period when science finally provided answers. Between those two moments were years of uncertainty. Years when investigators searched without knowing whether the truth would ever emerge. Years when families had to live without knowing who had taken their loved ones away. The emotional impact of a cold case is difficult to explain. There is grief after a loss. But there is also something different when the circumstances remain unknown. An unanswered murder creates a permanent question. The mind searches for explanations. The family wonders about possibilities. The community wonders whether the person responsible is still nearby. The uncertainty becomes its own form of suffering. That is why solving a cold case matters. Not because it changes what happened. It cannot. But because it changes what people are forced to carry. The families of victims no longer have to wonder whether the person responsible will ever be identified. They no longer have to ask whether the evidence was enough. They no longer have to live with a mystery surrounding the final moments of their loved one's life. The truth, even painful truth, is often better than endless uncertainty. The investigation also demonstrated the power of cooperation between different fields. Modern criminal investigations are rarely solved by one person or one technology. They require collaboration. Detectives, forensic scientists, genealogists, analysts, prosecutors. Each plays a role. The laboratory can provide a DNA profile. The genealogist can identify potential connections. The detective can verify information. The legal system can determine responsibility. Every stage depends on the previous one. A breakthrough is not created overnight. It is built, piece by piece, year after year. The cases of Stephanie Isaacson and Nanette Vanderberg also became part of a larger conversation about the future of forensic investigation. As technology continues improving, more cold cases may be revisited. Evidence once considered impossible to use may become valuable. Old investigations may receive new attention. Families who lost hope may receive unexpected answers. But with new technology comes responsibility. Investigators must balance the power of science with careful procedures. A genetic connection is a powerful investigative tool, but every conclusion must be supported by evidence. Justice requires accuracy. It requires patience. And it requires respect for everyone involved. The victims, the families, the accused, the community. Because the goal of a criminal investigation is not simply to close a file. It is to establish the truth in a way that can withstand examination. That principle was especially important in a case that had remained unresolved for so long. Decades of uncertainty created enormous public interest. People wanted answers. Families wanted justice. But investigators understood that emotion could never replace evidence. The case had to be built carefully. The science had to be clear. The facts had to speak for themselves. And ultimately, that was the power of the DNA evidence. It did not depend on fading memories. It did not depend on uncertain witness recollections. It did not depend on speculation. It provided a direct scientific connection. A connection that had waited silently for nearly 40 years. The story of these murders also reminds us that victims are never simply part of an investigation. They are the reason the investigation exists. Stephanie Isaacson and Nanette Vanderberg were young women whose lives should have continued far beyond the moments that became central to a criminal case. They should have experienced more birthdays, more friendships, more opportunities, more ordinary days. Their futures were stolen, but their names remained. Their stories remained, and their families continued carrying their memories. That is the true meaning behind solving a cold case. Not just identifying an offender, not just completing an investigation, but restoring recognition to the people whose lives were taken. After decades of silence, the evidence finally connected the past to the present. 2 murders, 3 years apart, 1 DNA profile, 1 path toward the truth. The case that once seemed impossible became another example of a powerful reality in modern justice. Time can delay answers, but time does not always defeat the truth. Because sometimes, hidden inside the smallest piece of evidence, the past is still waiting to be discovered. For nearly 4 decades, the murders of Stephanie Isaacson and Nanette Vanderberg remained a haunting reminder of how some questions can survive longer than the people who first asked them. Families changed. Investigators changed. Technology changed. But one thing remained constant: the search for the truth. The evidence that connected these two cases had survived through decades of uncertainty. It had remained preserved while the world around it transformed. What once appeared to be an impossible mystery had become a case that demonstrated the extraordinary power of modern forensic science. But behind every scientific achievement was a human story. 2 young women whose lives ended far too soon. 2 families forced to carry unimaginable grief. And a community that waited years for answers. The resolution of a cold case does not erase the tragedy that created it. It does not rewrite history. It does not give victims back the years they lost. Instead, it provides something else: recognition, accountability, a final understanding of what happened. For families who have spent decades living with uncertainty, that truth can become a powerful moment. Not a moment of celebration, but a moment of acknowledgement. The world finally understands what they have carried for so long. The names of Stephanie Isaacson and Nanette Vanderberg were no longer attached only to unanswered questions. They became part of a story about perseverance, a story about evidence, a story about the determination of investigators who refused to allow time to erase the possibility of justice. The investigation also revealed a fundamental lesson about criminal cases. The passage of time does not always benefit the person responsible. Many offenders believe that years will create distance. They believe memories will disappear. They believe evidence will become meaningless. But science continues moving forward, and evidence can survive. A single biological sample can outlast decades of silence. A single genetic connection can reopen a case that once seemed permanently closed. The advancement of forensic genealogy changed the landscape of criminal investigations because it transformed how investigators approach unidentified suspects. For generations, law enforcement relied on direct connections: a fingerprint match, a witness identification, a confession, a known suspect. But DNA genealogy introduced a different approach. Instead of searching only for the individual, investigators could search through relationships, through family connections, through genetic history. The method was not simple. It required careful analysis. It required extensive research. It required combining scientific information with traditional investigative methods. But when successful, it could reach places traditional methods could not. That is what made these cases so significant. The evidence collected decades earlier had not failed. It had simply been waiting for the right tool. The original investigators were not wrong because they could not solve the murders immediately. They were working within the limits of their time. The detectives who arrived at the crime scenes in the 1980s did not have access to today's technology. They did not have modern databases. They did not have advanced genetic analysis. They did not have the ability to trace biological evidence through generations. But they had something equally important: discipline. They collected evidence. They documented details. They preserved what they could. Their work created the foundation that allowed future investigators to continue the search. That connection between generations of investigators is one of the most important aspects of cold case resolution. The people who solve a case are often not the same people who began it. One generation gathers the evidence. Another generation discovers how to use it. Together, they create a continuous pursuit of justice. The story of Stephanie Isaacson and Nanette Vanderberg reflects that process. The investigations began decades earlier. The answers arrived decades later. But the mission remained the same: find the truth. Protect the memory of the victims. Hold the responsible person accountable. The case also raises a difficult question that appears in many long unsolved crimes. How does someone live for decades after committing such an act? How does someone continue through ordinary life knowing that two families were destroyed because of their actions? These questions often remain unanswered. Investigators can establish facts. They can reconstruct events. They can present evidence. But understanding the mind of someone who commits extreme violence is far more complicated. The criminal justice system focuses on responsibility. The victims' families focus on remembrance. Society focuses on prevention. Each perspective reveals a different part of the story. Together, they show why these cases matter beyond one investigation. They remind communities that victims should never become forgotten names in old records. They remind investigators that persistence matters. And they remind the public that advances in science can transform the impossible into the possible. The resolution of these murders also brought attention to other families still waiting. Families across the country continue living with unanswered questions. They continue hoping that evidence preserved today may become the breakthrough of tomorrow. A cold case is not always a dead case. Sometimes it is simply a case waiting for the future. The story of Stephanie Isaacson and Nanette Vanderberg became proof of that reality. For years, the evidence existed without an answer. Then, decades later, technology provided the missing link. The discovery did not happen because one person suddenly found a forgotten clue. It happened because many people continued working toward the same goal. Scientists improved forensic methods. Investigators reopened old files. Researchers followed genetic connections. Families kept demanding answers. Every effort contributed to the final result. That is the nature of justice in long-term investigations. It is rarely one dramatic moment. It is a collection of decisions made over many years. A choice to preserve evidence. A choice to investigate one more lead. A choice to look again at a case everyone else had stopped discussing. Those choices can change everything. For Stephanie and Nanette, those choices ensured their stories would not disappear. Their names continued being spoken. Their cases continued being examined. Their lives continued being remembered. And after decades of uncertainty, the truth finally emerged from the smallest trace left behind. A DNA sample. Invisible. Silent. But powerful enough to cross generations. Powerful enough to connect two separate tragedies. Powerful enough to bring investigators closer to justice. The journey from crime scene to courtroom had taken decades. But the evidence had never forgotten. The victims had never been forgotten. And the search had never truly ended. Because some cases are not solved when the investigation begins. They are solved when the world finally has the ability to understand the evidence that was there all along. For Stephanie Isaacson and Nanette Vanderberg, that moment arrived after a lifetime of waiting. A mystery that began in the 1980s had finally reached the present. Two families finally had answers. And two names that had carried decades of pain were finally connected to a truth that could no longer remain hidden. For decades, two families lived with a silence that no one should ever have to endure. A silence created by unanswered questions. A silence that returned every year on anniversaries, during holidays, and in the quiet moments when memories became impossible to ignore. The murders of Stephanie Isaacson and Nanette Vanderberg were separated by time, but connected by something far more powerful than distance. A single DNA profile. A hidden thread that remained invisible for nearly 40 years. The evidence had been collected long before the technology existed to understand its full meaning. It survived through changing generations of investigators, changing methods, and changing expectations. But it never disappeared. And eventually, it provided the answer that so many people had waited for. The conclusion of this investigation was not simply a victory for forensic science. It was a reminder that every victim matters. Every case matters. Every unanswered question deserves the possibility of an answer. Stephanie Isaacson and Nanette Vanderberg were not just names in police reports. They were young women with lives ahead of them. They were daughters, friends, people who had dreams, relationships, and futures that should have continued. The crimes that took their lives became the focus of a decades-long investigation, but their identities were always more important than the violence that surrounded them. That is one of the most important lessons in any homicide case. Behind every piece of evidence is a person. Behind every investigation is a family. Behind every cold case is a story that deserves to be remembered. The journey to justice in these cases was long because the path was never simple. Investigators faced the same obstacles that challenge cold cases everywhere. Limited information, changing technology, fading memories, missing witnesses, years passing without answers. But the investigation continued because the evidence remained, and because people refused to accept that time should determine whether justice was possible. The advancement of DNA technology changed the direction of the cases forever. What once represented an unknown biological sample became a connection between past and present. The science did not replace detective work. It strengthened it. It provided investigators with a new opportunity to revisit questions that had remained unanswered for decades. The process demonstrated the remarkable evolution of criminal investigations. In the 1980s, detectives depended heavily on traditional methods. They followed physical clues. They interviewed witnesses. They examined circumstances surrounding the crimes. Those efforts were essential, but some answers remained beyond reach. Decades later, a new generation of investigators used tools that earlier detectives could never have imagined. Advanced DNA analysis, genetic genealogy, modern forensic techniques. Together, these methods transformed evidence that had been silent for years into information capable of changing lives. The significance of the investigation extended beyond these two cases. It represented hope for countless families still waiting. Families who continue asking the same questions. Who was responsible? Why did this happen? Will the truth ever be known? For many, cold cases create a unique kind of pain. There is grief, but there is also uncertainty. A solved case cannot undo the loss. But an unsolved case leaves families trapped between memory and mystery. The identification of a responsible individual can provide something that years of waiting cannot. A definitive answer. The truth. Even when that truth is painful. The story of Stephanie Isaacson and Nanette Vanderberg also demonstrates why preserving evidence is one of the most important responsibilities in criminal investigations. When investigators collected biological material decades ago, they could not know exactly how valuable it would become. They could not predict the future of forensic science. They could not imagine that technology would one day analyze evidence at a level beyond anything available at the time. They simply preserved the possibility, and that possibility became justice. Every cold case contains a lesson about patience. Justice does not always arrive quickly. Sometimes it takes years, sometimes decades. Sometimes it requires an entire generation of investigators to pass the responsibility to the next. But as long as evidence survives and people continue searching, the possibility remains. The conclusion of these cases also reminds us that technology alone cannot solve crimes. Behind every breakthrough are people. Scientists who analyze evidence carefully. Detectives who continue asking questions. Researchers who build connections. Families who keep speaking the names of those they lost. Without that determination, even the most advanced technology would remain meaningless. The human commitment to finding answers is what turns evidence into justice. The murders of Stephanie Isaacson and Nanette Vanderburg began as tragedies. They became investigations. They became cold cases. And eventually, they became examples of how persistence and science can work together to uncover the truth. But the most important part of their story is not the technology. It is the reminder that victims are never forgotten. Years may pass. Headlines may disappear. Investigators may change. But the lives lost remain significant. Their stories continue. Their memories continue. Their names continue. The final answer in these cases came from something impossibly small. A microscopic piece of evidence left behind decades earlier. Something invisible. Something silent. Something that waited patiently until the world had the ability to understand it. That DNA sample carried more than genetic information. It carried a message from the past. A message that said the truth had not disappeared. A message that said the victims had not been forgotten. A message that said justice, even delayed, was still possible. 2 murders. 3 years apart. 1 hidden connection. 1 breakthrough that changed everything. The story of Stephanie Isaacson and Nanette Vanderburg stands as a powerful reminder that time does not always protect those responsible for terrible crimes. Evidence can survive. Investigations can continue. And answers can still emerge from places where people once believed there was only silence. After nearly 40 years, the mystery was no longer a mystery. The unanswered questions finally had answers. The evidence finally had a voice. And the names of Stephanie Isaacson and Nanette Vanderburg finally received the justice and recognition they had waited so long to find.